We're joined by our good friend, Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at Western University. Hi, Salim.
Hi, good afternoon.
Great. And
Nice
Salim has a... What's that?
I said, nice to be back with you.
Yes, it's been a while, hasn't it? I sort of
Yeah.
took the summer off and you've been out touring, which is why we're having this conversation, because you went out to Alberta and British Columbia and you had some really good meetings with a lot of fine people, freedom fighters all, and some really good reception. And that's what struck me, was that I've been in this game for maybe about 36 years. And when we started talking to the public, whether it was with the Freedom Party of Ontario or the Reform Party or London Middlesex Taxpayers Coalition or various groups that I've been involved with, trying to promote individual freedom, perhaps less taxes with the London Middlesex Taxpayers Coalition, or when I was a school trustee meeting with like-minded people and parents, I never saw a huge turnout. The most I think we ever got with the London Middlesex Taxpayers Coalition was about 500 people, about 100 of which after the meeting sort of marched on City Hall to intimidate them into not passing a particular budget. Other than that, you don't get a lot of people out there interested in politics per se, unless they're on the left and they're basically financed to go out and cause trouble or to parade or protest or, stir up trouble. But the freedom people, it's like herding cats, I found. Now, your experience in your tour out west in September was heartening in that now that we've just gone through this 2 years or plus of lockdowns and masking and various measures which violated everybody's constitutional rights, all of a sudden people have woken up. And it's good to see that they're coming out in droves to hear people like yourself, or a Mark Friesen, or a Pastor Pawlowski out in the West. So why don't you give us a story about your tour, Salim, and hopefully it'll cheer some people up to know that there are a lot of people out there of like mind when it comes to individual rights and freedoms.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robert. It was, as I wrote when I came back, or actually I started writing sitting in the airport, getting back, long flight and long layovers. That the 2 weeks or more that I spent on the road was absolutely exhilarating in terms of my mind and my battery being recharged after 2.5 years of this lockdown, band-aids, and what we have gone through, and we are still going through. And that's another discussion of where is our country on these matters. But coming back after this 2+ week of being on the road between Edmonton and Kamloops, was truly exhilarating. And there's so much to talk about, but I don't know how much time we have, but I might want to put it in the following way very quickly. There is the personal sense, the sense of exhilaration, the sense of feeling recharged, and there is the public dimension of the conversation we had and what it means, what is happening, that goes unreported in central Canada, so much of it that I did not myself know until I hit the road over there. So at the personal level, it was a discovery of a significant part of our country that is so beautiful, so grand and majestic and magnificent, that nature and God has given us, and I suppose that's the fact that I was sort of discovering it, though I have been to the West, but I've already flown over to the West, so to speak. But going through the deep interior of Alberta, particularly British Columbia, was a magnificent discovery of our country. And I think a lot of people don't know how great our country is in that sense. We are so blessed with just about everything. I mean, I was told in one small town where we spent the night. And I spent the night with an elderly couple of German background, both husband and wife, who are now grandparents. And he had come as a young man after the war. His father had been a German who was conscripted in the Third Reich's army, the Wehrmacht, and sent to the Eastern Front. They did not know that he had survived the war and came back after about half a dozen years after the war was over. He had been a prisoner of war in Russia. And then they migrated to Canada, and where they eventually settled in Canada, this little village that I was in, or town that I was in, he said, Dieter is his name, he said that this is what my father's generation and people who came here and moved from central Canada to this part of the world, they saw it as a little Bavaria, and the mountains and the pine forests and the river and so on and so forth. So yeah, and I think a lot of Canadians need to rediscover their country. If they have not discovered it, they need to go out and discover their country. And what we are trying to do, that is what the people are struggling for, is to keep this country without being radically transformed into something else that they did not give their consent. Democracy is, after all, a government based upon the consent of the people. And what has been happening for these past several decades is the consent of the people has been lacking. It is simply the elite, that 1% or whatever, is been driving their agenda, and we are just like sheep being pulled in that direction. So that is at the personal level that was so majestic and beautiful, and also sad, because how many countries in the world has as much as what we have: natural resources, land, forest, timber, water, just about everything that nature can give has been given in amplitudes to Canada and Canadians. And on the public side of it is, of course, the movements that are taking place at the ground level, at the grassroots level. You and I both have, in that sense, been attached to the idea of grassroots democracy. It is that about the people, and it is about what the people want and think, and they should be part of the conversation. In fact, the most elemental and central part of the conversation in a country that respects their own people, which I think has been lost in Canada, as it has been lost in much of the West. So I see what has happened, or I saw what is happening, and met with people and talked with people, is that Alberta is once again going to be a province in Canada that is going to really shape up Canadian politics going forward, and we need to talk about that. So that is something that is extremely important. I might just say one more thing as we go forward in this conversation. I feel, and this is my first take on this matter, and I've been thinking about it, but I feel that the part of the country I went through, that is two major provinces in Canada, Western provinces, and the interior, and the people I met, these remain still, in that classic sense, still traditional, still bound to the soil. Still, there is a cohesive sense of belonging as Canadian to an idea and an ideal that was handed down to the present generation from the past generations of Canadians who built this country. As I was just mentioning, Dieter and his wife and their grandparents now. And Dieter came to Canada in 1955, 56, when he was about 15 years old. He was born just before the war in 1938. And I'm taking Dieter as an example because there are many Dieters out there. He came as a 15-year-old. He's now in his mid-80s. He's built up his farm. He built up a business. At 15, when he arrived, he did not know English. He acquired that language just as his father and mother did. His father was a broken man, having been a prisoner of war and having gone through a war that was most horrendous, particularly in the Eastern Front. And they went through a hard time. But they literally, one might say, with the bootstrap, built up their home, the farm, and contributed to that part of the country, which is where they live now. It's a small town. I think it is called Crestor, but I forget the name right now, where it is, what town it was. And he talked about it, learning English. He went to a craftsman school, became a carpenter. But his brother, who was born in Canada, after his father had come back, and he hadn't seen his father till he came back, and he was a teenager or getting on to be a teenager, then had a second son when he reunited with his wife. And so his brother is about 14 years younger than him. And he's in Vernon, BC, and he's a medical doctor, and he's practicing. So, in the family, between a man who is now in his mid-80s, who came as a young man with his parents, barely into the teenage years, and then went on to make a life of his own with his father as a craftsman. And the younger brother, who was born in Canada and grew up in Canada, and a whole opportunity was opened up. And so the contrast, this is a story that tells about Canada in the sense that the younger brother just embraced the opportunity that was given to him. And he is a medical doctor in Vernon, and that journey between the two brothers and the family tells a lot about the sort of people that built this country. And so the conversations that we had, people who turned out, and we went through beginning in Edmonton and then all the way down the road into Calgary and Medicine Hat and so on, and southern Calgary, and then into BC, all the way up to the West Coast, Okanagan Valley, Penticton, and so on. This is the part of the country, small towns, farming towns, industrial towns, but not major industries. The people still share, the people are cohesive, people have the same values, they go to the churches, they pray together. And that's why we could have these conversations. And that's why they turned out in these large numbers. I was surprised with the turnout of people because, in the small town, we were in churches and we were in theaters, auditorium, school auditorium, and they were packed. And I was thinking about why was it so? I don't think it would be packed here if we were going through London, Ontario, or Hamilton, Ontario, or, into the GTA, for instance, that you and I know of. We wouldn't draw that people. We wouldn't have that sort of conversation. People are too here occupied with their own individual self. They're not concerned in that sense deeply because they don't engage in this conversation, and the media doesn't help. What the small town people are, that is, for them, when they heard about this thing through word of mouth or through posters, they all came out and they wanted to not only hear us, but they wanted to share with us their stories or their views and their thoughts. And that is what either we preserve through our system of politics, or we lose it and become that much poorer as a country, which we are already becoming.
It's funny that you differentiate between the urban and the rural, which I agree with, and the voting record actually bears out. But I don't know whether or not I agree that you will not find that kind of a crowd in a London or a Toronto or a Montreal or a larger urban center, because sheer numbers alone would dictate that that you would get a good turnout. As a matter of fact, if you consider even before the pandemic, when Maxime Bernier went around talking about individual freedom and individual rights, and this is, 2019, there was great crowds. As a matter of fact, I hosted one thing in London, Ontario, where you spoke and Maxime spoke, and there were 300 people there. Now, this is a brand new party, and you get 300 people coming out to that. I found that in London, Ontario, to be quite remarkable. And I'm sure that when he was in Toronto and other major cities, he would get quite a good reception. So I think that the idea of individual rights and freedoms is resonating with a lot of Canadians. It's just that when you get into the melting pots of the urban centers, you have a melting pot of ideas and cultures, not all of which, in my estimation, are aligned with the founding values and ideas of Canada. But still, you'll get lots of people out.
Yes, I mean, Robert, I mean, I'm just giving you my first impression on this matter without having gone deep into it and making a comparative analysis. You're right. I mean, in 2019 election, people turnout was very encouraging. But then what happened? It drifted away. I mean, you were part of my campaign, or my campaign wouldn't have been there without you. So you know the details at great depth in the matter. We drew people, but when it mattered at the ballot box, either our election process itself is lacking integrity, as we now know that the American election process lacks integrity. And that is another indicator of where the West has gone. I mean, we were proud about being a democracy, our election, respecting people's rights and so on and so forth. But when people begin to question the integrity of the process and the election system, then everything is up for game. There is nothing that can any longer be trusted. And trust is totally missing now in the West. The political leaders are not trusted anymore by anyone. The media is not trusted. And the so-called experts are not trusted, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But I would say this. Take the case of Edmonton and Calgary, the two major urban centers in Alberta. If you're in Edmonton or in Calgary, you could be anywhere in the GTA, Ontario, Toronto, or the similar situation, except for language difference in Montreal or Quebec City. This is now the multicultural cities. And very rapidly changing. The two cities, Edmonton and Calgary, are the two largest cities in Alberta. And the mayor of both the cities come from this multicultural background of liberal ideology, So you have this, the mayor of Edmonton is a liberal politician who was a liberal MP. I'm forgetting his name right now. He's a Sikh Canadian, and he is the mayor of the largest city in Alberta. And the same thing with Calgary. Now is a woman, Miss Gonduk, is her name, Gondek or Gonduk, Jyoti Gondek. She is a Punjabi Sikh. She replaces Nahid Nenshi, who was an Ismaili Muslim who had been the mayor of Calgary for 2 terms, if not more, so almost a decade. And that itself, if you go scratching deep into this matter, tells a whole story of what is happening, not only in the big cities, but in a sense, the politics of Canada. The politics of Canada is being driven by the forces that have changed the character of Canada in terms of multiculturalism. It would have been different if the changes had been in terms of ethnicity. Canada, in that sense, has been drawing upon population from around the world. And so we are, as I maintain, and I think you agree, a multi-ethnic country. And so as Canadians, we come from different backgrounds, but there would be some sort of a core value to which we would be, coming together and holding, as Canadian. That, I think, has become very diluted in these cities. And that is where the contrast comes up, going through the interior of Alberta, going through the interior of BC. And I think that would be also true if we did make similar tour in the Maritimes, I suppose, outside of the main urban center, Halifax or St. John and so on, Moncton. That would also in some ways be true, and would be true also in Northern Ontario, if we travel up around the Great Lake area. But that contrast is that while Canada was built by immigrants, first immigrants and settlers were of European stock, European origin, and that is so palpable and visible when you're traveling through the interior. People who developed the country, who did the farming and so on and so forth, the hard labor, build the roads, build the railways. Even though, Chinese coolies were brought in, and even though you see in the British Columbia interior, you see presence of Indians, that is Indians from my part of the world, not native Indians, because of people who were brought in for the timber industry. So the Sikhs and Indians are quite present in the interior, not in large numbers, but they are present, and you can see that. But what is significant is, I come back to, is the sense of belonging and coming together. Whether you were, I ran into Doukhobors. I had barely read about the Doukhobors, in my undergraduate years, and it had faded from my memory. It's like the Amish in southwestern Ontario or in Pennsylvania. The Doukhobors are people of Russian ethnicity who were under heavy persecution and oppression in the pre-revolutionary Russia, and then that was amplified in revolutionary Russia because they were pacifists, like the Mennonites. And those who were lucky, they were able to escape, and they came to Canada. And then in Canada, they went through persecution and oppression because they didn't speak the language, the culture was different, and they were held in suspicion. Many of them were forced into schooling system and other intervention by the governments, by the authorities. And there are stories about Doukhobors protesting, women coming out. I believe many of them, demonstrated by undressing themselves and showing how they were being treated and so on. There are very sad stories. Anyhow, I ran into them and I had a chance to talk with them, and so on. So you have this diverse background: Germans, Scandinavians, Dutch, who settle the prairies, East Europeans. But once they settle, especially immediately after the initial people who arrived, the second generation that came of age in Canada, and now third and fourth generation, they became Canadians. They took to the flag, they took to the country, they took to the language, they took to the traditions and culture, which was, what was it? It was primarily Anglo-Saxon, right? I mean, we were part of the crown, the British crown, and we still are, in that sense, a constitutional monarchy. And so that underlying strength that gave them the identity of being Canadian. They might have been Doukhobors and Mennonites and Dutch and German. After all, 2 world wars were fought against Germany, and the people of German descent who were in Canada, they participated in going to war against Germany, and so on. So that I see very much. That's been my subject. That's what you and I have talked about at length. I see that is still present, which is lost in the main centers, urban centers, So here you have Alberta with 34 seats in the federal government, and repeatedly, overwhelmingly, Albertans have voted to send conservative members to Ottawa, right? In the last election, the 2021 election, if my memory serves me, out of 34 seats, 32 members are conservative members that were sent to Ottawa, one NDP and one Liberal from Edmonton and I think Calgary or outside of Calgary, but from the larger urban center. But rural Alberta interior have voted consistently for the Conservative Party, believing that the Conservative Party is a party that they can trust, that the party is devoted to defend what is Alberta's interest and the stake within the Confederation. But at the ground level, at the grassroots level, the Conservative Party represent them in the sense, share in common, and are devoted to social and religious conservatism. I mean, the church-going members or the people, who take the issue of God, faith, and country and family seriously. That's what the Conservative Party also hold on to, or is expected to hold on to. So that's been the sense of politics. I don't think that's the sense of politics in central Canada, because the overwhelming number of seats are from the metropolitan cities. I mean, 34 seats from Alberta. You have from the GTA, the same number of seats, almost 31 seats in the GTA, that is minus Toronto, 31 seats to the parliament, whereas the whole province, and you're only a part of the Ontario number of seats. So you can see where Alberta sends conservative members, the GTA sends Liberals and NDP.
Well, now are we falling into the trap of making a differentiation between conservative, liberal, NDP when no such differentiation exists? I think in the last 50 years, at least since Mulrooney, it has been conclusively proven that they're all the same. As a matter of fact, your recent Substack, I think it's your first Substack post at salimmansur.substack.com, for those who want to go and read it, where you talk about your trip out west. You spend a great deal of ink trying to express the fact that the Conservatives screwed over the West, always. Politically speaking, there is no difference in Canada unless you want to talk about the PPC, or, as I hope that you're going to be talking about in provincial politics, the new independent party of Alberta. Wouldn't you agree?
Given that we are a country of 5 time zones, there will be differences. There will be, we are a vast country, and there are, whether you call it sectional differences or regional differences, those are going to be there. Alberta, for instance, is one of the resource-rich provinces of Canada. And being one of the resource-rich provinces of Canada, Alberta's view of its own provincial future, stake in the Federation, its own sense of its future, of Albertans' future in terms of where Alberta wants to go or where Alberta wants to remain, as opposed to being driven by the forces of central Canada, is something going to be that different in some ways than, say, the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, taken all together or separately, or for that matter, where you come from, Newfoundland, and the interest of Newfoundland and how they see they've been treated by the Federation, whether they have advanced or they have regressed. Those are going to be the stories that will be talked about in the drinking houses of Newfoundland, just as there are stories talked about in the drinking houses of Alberta. And there will be different stories in that sense. And yet there are forces that is going to bring together what is happening in Canadian politics. And so as Canadians, we might not be completely alien to each other if we pay attention to what the discussion is going on. And that's what I tried to do. So talking about Canada and then Alberta and where we are at this point in time and what I learned is what, to put it again, in a nutshell, much of the politics of Alberta, and to that extent, British Columbia, the interior, the people in the interior, is one in which the people acutely understand and feel the imbalances of the Federation. That whatever the Albertans want or would like to see happen or propose in a pan-Canadian sense, but having that Albertan flavor, and so the Albertans can feel part of decision-making, that they're sitting on the table with Canadians from the Maritime, with Canadians from Quebec, with Canadians from Central Canada, and so on. And so everybody is being heard, and everybody's voices have some degree of equality in this discussion, and people pay attention. That is missing, that they sense the imbalances, that whatever Alberta says, Alberta will not be taken seriously. And they have tried this out, any number of times that we can go back into the history of our federation when Alberta became a province of Canada, 1905, as did Saskatchewan. Manitoba was in the 1870s. So these imbalances have not been addressed. We can go all the way back to, as I was writing, to the National Energy Program of the 1980s, late 70s and early 80s, where unilaterally Pierre-Elliott Trudeau and his Liberal government imposed policies that the Albertans were outraged by. That is the tax that was put on their oil resources, the nationalization program that took place, and the conditions that were imposed that, in a sense, prevented Alberta to develop their own natural resources in a manner in which they would have liked to see, because natural resources are within the provincial jurisdiction, within the BNA Act. It is not something that the central government, that Ottawa can monopolize and dictate. And yet that is what happened. And that continues to happen. It is not something that happened and people learned their lesson and made the adjustment. That didn't happen. And so I recalled, which is what you just mentioned, Mulroney. Mulroney was elected, the conservative prime minister. Let's just go by the nominal name, progressive conservative, so he was not a liberal prime minister, he was a conservative prime minister. And he got he got the largest majority in his first electoral win to become the prime minister in 1984, the year Pierre-Elliott Trudeau took his famous walk in the snow and resigned after having brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedom in 1982, after having defeated René Lévesque's referendum in 1980. And so he left, and Mulroney came in as the prime minister with the largest number of seats won by any conservative prime minister since John Diefenbaker's famous victory. I think it was in 1957 or 56. And then what is the story of Brian Mulroney? I mean, his famous words, "You dance with those who brung you." So he danced with those who brung him was the Quebec nationalists. He made the Faustian bargain with the Quebec separatists and nationalists, who then turned around and voted for the progressive conservative and gave him a massive victory.
And not only that, Salim, you recall, if it wasn't for Mulroney, you would not have the Bloc Québécois, and you would not have the Reform Party. Both were offshoots of the disaffection with the Conservative Party under Brian Mulroney. The Bloc Québécois, if people don't remember, were Conservative Party members of Parliament who said no and who just made their own bloc. And it was the Quebec Bloc. And because of Mulroney's policies in the West, what happened? You had Preston Manning come out and attach himself to the disaffection of the Westerners to create the Reform Party. Thank you, Brian Mulroney.
No, yeah, I mean, we need to recount that to put in context, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I have been quite insistent in my career, to put things in context. Things don't happen outside of context. So Mulroney got the votes in the prairie provinces, except in British Columbia, where there were a few stragglers, NDP and Liberals. Right through the prairie province, they overwhelmingly voted for Mulroney, Tories or Progressive Conservative. And then the vote came from Quebec that gave him that immense majority. But Mulroney himself was a Quebecois in the sense that he was born and raised, and that was his calling card. An Irish Canadian from Baie-Comeau who spoke French with a slang. His bonhomie, his way of going about it, storytelling and glad handing and all of that, a politics of the old type, where you gather up people and pour beer into them, or let them have as much beer as they can, and drive them into wherever they're going to the convention, and vote for you. And that's what he did. And he won the leadership when Joe Clark was not happy with the number of votes that he got, though he had the majority. And Joe Clark became history, and Mulroney becomes the prime minister. But as you point out, his Faustian bargain was in Quebec, and he served Quebec's interest. It is interesting, if there had been an opening for a man of ambition like Mulroney, who was purely a politician out to make a name for himself, in some ways, he would have been a liberal. But there was no place for him in a liberal party with Pierre Trudeau and the others from Quebec, Jean Chrétien and others, who would step aside for Mulroney. So he chose to take over the Progressive Conservative Party, and he won in 1984, and then he won in 1988. But looking from the Western side, this whole issue, since John Diefenbaker, there has been no prime minister in Ottawa that came from the West. I'm not even mentioning Joe Clark, because Joe Clark was a joke, a total accidental man who happened to end up winning in 79 and then losing in 79, which is his great achievement. In the same year that he won, he lost. He didn't know how to count. So Joe Clark was a joke, and he's gone. So since John Diefenbaker, there had been no prime minister from the West that represented or understood the West. And so the Western Canadians, went along with the conservative or progressive conservative. Remember the Social Credit Party that used to be there, and there was a block of Social Credit members in the House throughout the 70s that represented that core group of prairie voters who were not NDPers in that sense. They were not socialists, but who were devoted to, for lack of better sense, to talk about family, country, and faith. That was their driving card. And Preston Manning came from those roots. His father, Ernest Manning, belonged to that root, as a minister, evangelical Christian. His son, and he had been the premier of Alberta, and his son then coming out of that background, that tradition. The West voted for Mulroney. And then in 1986, that you recall, which is what I was mentioning in my memo, that people have forgotten it. And that's, how long is it, Bob? We are reaching back almost 40 years, isn't it? 1984 election, It's going to be 40 years in 2 years' time, 38 years ago, 35 years ago, 34 years ago, when that decision was made by Mulroney to hand the contract for the maintenance of CF-18 to Canada Air in Quebec, when Bristol Aerospace had given a much better bid at a lower cost from Winnipeg. And everybody expected, or wanted to see that the West be given this contract of CF-18. The West had turned out in large numbers within the military forces. When we talk about the West, by the way, this thought keeps coming back to me. We're talking about in American politics, the flyover country, that came together in the 2016 election, the country that is taken for granted and ignored, and it's called deplorables. Well, this is it. I mean, the Canadian Prime Minister in February called the trucker convoy, the people who came together in defense of freedom, the fringe. So the West is the fringe, the West is the deplorable, the West is the flyover country. And Mr. Mulroney just slapped them on the face. And what was the result of that? The result came together immediately afterward. The next year, Preston Manning put together the Reform Party, and the slogan was not of separation, as is the Quebec nationalist separatists. It is the West wants in, but the West will have its own voice in the parliament. The West wants in. And in the 1993 election, the result of the decisions of Mulroney crashed with the Progressive Conservative Party left with 2 seats and wiped out. And his coalition that he made with the Quebec separatists ended up becoming the loyal opposition under Lucien Bouchard, the birth of the Bloc Québécois. That is his legacy, Mulroney's legacy. His entire prime ministership crashed not only on the basis of that decision about CF-18, but a whole series of decisions at the heart of which was, he was going to be the prime minister that is going to get Quebec to sign the constitution deal that Quebec had refused to sign under René Lévesque, and then again under Mr. Robert Bourassa. So that was the Meech Lake Accord. Quebec wants in, Quebec distinct society. Again, the West was totally out of the picture. The entire 8-9 years of Mulroney government was fixated with Quebec. Quebec has been the fixation of Canadian politics. You might go back to the Plains of Abraham, So there it is. This is the federation where only one province has driven the agenda of national politics, both in political sense, in sense of the federation, constitutional issues, and then on the matter of economic issues and economic development and so on and so forth. It has been Quebec. I mean, you take the case since 1968, when Pierre-Elliott Trudeau became the prime minister, to now, more than a half a century. And you count on your fingers how many prime ministers we have had and how many of them are from Quebec. The only one I can think of who was a prime minister in this 50-year plus period is Stephen Harper from the West. Again, I said Joe Clark, we can just drop him, is inconsequential. The West are all from Quebec, just Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, and Justin Trudeau. A country run by prime ministers from Quebec with the majority seats in central Canada, Ontario and Quebec making a compact, that is the Laurentian elite, that's the family compact, that's the Montreal, Quebec City, Ottawa, Toronto, triangle, and that's what has happened. So West wants in, that was the Reform Party agenda. And in 1993, In 1988 election, Reform only won one seat, Deborah Gray. In 1993, Reform swept the Western provinces. It elected 53 members. It fell short of 3 seats. If they had 3 more seats, Ontario did not vote for them. They had 3 more seats, they would have been the loyal opposition and not Bloc Québécois with Lucien Bouchard. So that's the context. Traveling through Alberta this time around, it was the discovery for me that the past is never the past. The past only resurfaces in different costumes, in maybe different slang and language, but it is the same past that comes, because it's like the ghost of Hamlet's father, is not going to go away unless it is resolved. The issues are somehow met. And what it is now is a resurfacing in Alberta of this movement, the independence movement in Alberta. Now there is a party, the Independence Party of Alberta, which is going to contest the next provincial election, which is due next year. And it'll contest all the seats. It has a presence right across the province. I met the leader now, who has been elected by the people. He happened to come to our event in Calgary when we were there. And he heard about our event, and he came to that event after the vote had taken place. And I'm talking about Pastor Arthur Pawlowski. This name should start being registered in the minds of Central Canadians in a manner that it deserves to be registered going forward in time. Pastor Pawlowski is now the leader of the Independence Party of Alberta. He won the leadership handsomely. There is the Alberta Prosperity Project, which is a non-partisan movement in Alberta that was founded a few years ago. I had no idea about it because nobody writes and talks about it. The mainstream media hasn't spoken about it in our part of the world. And I discovered that the people who are connected with the Alberta Prosperity Project, this is, in a sense, the who's who of Alberta. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who has been in the forefront during this vaccine mass mandate, talking about the utter lack of any reason for what we have been put through. And he has become a very prominent Albertan, given who he is as a medical practitioner, but who has taken the time to go out in the public and say things that few wants to say from the medical profession because of the constraints they're under through their provincial governing bodies, and they can be de-licensed very quickly. The punitive measures that have been taken by provincial governments and by the central government, by the federal government. So Dr. Roger Hodkinson stands apart from all of them in that sense. He's a very prominent member of the Alberta Prosperity Project, and I learned from him what is happening, and they have been devoting a lot of time and a lot of money that has been raised in private sector to educate Albertans through seminars, webinars, getting together, flyers, and so on and so forth. They have chapters across Alberta talking about Alberta's future, Alberta's economy, Alberta's prospect. And out of that movement has come this Independence Party of Alberta, though they are not connected in the sense there's no official connection, but the members circulate within each other. And the Independence Party of Alberta, I have their policy in my hand, or their position in my hand, so I can read it out to them. And once I read it out to them, you and I can easily sign up and be members, because every aspect of it is laudable and worthy, and in a sense it is PPC's position. So let me quickly read it to you. Its slogan is about prosperity, freedom, and opportunity for Alberta, fiscal responsibility, accountability, and transparency. And bullet points, individual rights and freedom, government accountability, Alberta energy first, balanced social and fiscal responsibility, a constitution for Albertans by Albertans, taxation with representation, responsible financial assistance program, promotion of Alberta businesses, healthcare that promotes wellness, education program that support practical life skills and achievements, maintain our leadership in environmental standards, national police force to replace municipal policing and RCMP, reform firearm policy, and the key position is as soon as it forms a government in Alberta, after winning an election, maybe the next election, Independence Party of Alberta might win. The first act will be to prepare for a referendum. They're going to table a referendum for Alberta independence to make Alberta the Republic of Alberta. And the people I spoke with are so full of energy and enthusiasm. Dr. Roger Hodkinson is just one person, Viva la Alberta. but it is infectious, contagious, the spirit, the sense that yes, and this is not about white Albertans, cowboy rodeo wearing Albertans. It's Albertans across the board. That's what their appeal is. You are an Albertan, it is you and I together. We can be a prosperous republic given what we have and what we have been denied. So it is this imbalance of the federation that is coming home. And as I made a note of it is, Alberta is the weak link in the federation. When Preston Manning and the Reform Party, by the way, you and I were both members of the Reform Party. We ran in the 2000 election.
And the Canadian Alliance.
We embraced the Reform. Exactly, we embraced the Reform Party because we saw the big ideas of Reform Party, that is the EEE Senate, that is a balanced budget, that is paying down the debt, or issues, and of course, the issue of freedom, individual rights and freedom, that these are issues that should and must, if we go out and talk to people, resonate with the people. This is why we are Canadians. But more important, this is why we are North Americans. We might have our differences with the United States in terms of historical development, but in terms of the core ideas, when Mr. Justin Trudeau says Canada has no core identity, he should be very quickly exported to Ukraine, because he's all about Ukraine. So let's export him to Ukraine, a country possibly that has no core idea. The core idea there is the neo-Nazi movement of the Banderistas. But in Canada, we have the core idea. The core idea is the idea of freedom, of individual rights and freedom. That's why people from all around the world want to come to Canada or come to the United States, right? So the Albertans are saying that this is what we are and who we are. And what Albertans are saying is what you in New Brunswick can agree with. People in Southern Ontario, if they are given a proper representation, can agree with in the sense of explanation. And the weak link is that the Albertans are far more aware of the imbalance of the federation, that to correct that imbalance means either Alberta has to go its own way. No longer West wants in, it is Alberta wants out. So that's the way to correct the imbalance, by Alberta acquiring its own independence. Or if it fails to do that in its first referendum, the very tabling of that motion and the preparation for that referendum should shake up rest of Canada in a manner that we haven't been. If we are serious about keeping our federation together, if we are serious about keeping our country together, we have to address the imbalances which the Conservative Party has failed to do. In fact, the Conservative Party has been in league with the left-wing parties, which has two faces, the Liberal Party and the NDP. And now we might say it has a third face, the Green Party. So Conservative Party has been fully, complicit with the three-face left-wing political parties of the elite in Canada to maintain the imbalance on behalf of central Canada, but more particularly on behalf of Quebec.
It's interesting that we sometimes, sorry, Salim, we sometimes think that everything is the way it is and shall remain the way it is. I mean, if we're born into Canada with 10 provinces and 2 territories, now 3, that it will always be that way, and that's what we grew up to believe in. But you and I both undoubtedly have known people who were alive before Alberta joined Canada. And it didn't join by a referendum, by the way. It was brought in by legislative edict. So much for that. Although back in those days, 1905, there was very never heard of referenda. But my grandfather, born in 1899, I knew him. I have memories of him. And yet he lived before Newfoundland even joined Confederation. And he lived before Saskatchewan and Alberta joined Confederation. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, given political timelines, that yes, this Confederation experiment that we've been involved in has proven to be a failure for a lot of segments or regions or sectors of this country. And I think a referendum in Alberta, just like a referendum in Quebec, will shake up a few things, and perhaps for the positive. And if Alberta separates, I think that would be a good plan for Alberta. And maybe it will allow the rest of Canada to understand just how much we rely on them for so many things, if not just keeping the houses warm, even though here in New Brunswick, it all comes from Saudi Arabia, more or less. So yeah, I think that we should, as you continually say, put things in context, time-wise, stand back, look at the big picture, and see that Alberta was brought in, the Albertans themselves were brought into this confederation just by an act of parliament, of the respective parliaments, and not by any popular vote or anything like that. So yeah, if they want to have a referendum to leave, I think 50% plus 1 should be sufficient, regardless of what Jean Chrétien's clarity bill may have said. And let's see how it will go.
Yes, two issues on what you have just put on the table. My response or my thoughts are, provinces were brought in. You're quite right about that, but that is the history of how federations evolve over time. The 13 colonies in the United States, it could have been more than 13 colonies if the colonies up along the St. Lawrence Valley and in the Maritime had joined with the 13 colonies. It might have been, 18, 19, 20 colonies becoming the United States of America. But 13 colonies became, and then other states were brought in as the settlers moved, as Louisiana Purchase took place under President Jefferson, the third president, that brought in a whole new territories, west of the Mississippi. And so these lands were then demarcated and marked out and made into states. But the key point is that these states that evolved, boundaries were set up, making of Montana, making of Indiana, making of Missouri, and so on and so forth, all the way to Hawaii being brought in, just as Newfoundland was brought in. In the case
except that Newfoundland voted to join. Hawaiians, I don't think did. They were annexed.
Fair enough. Newfoundland, in that sense, is an exception. It voted. But the point that I'm driving at, the key point here is that the constitutional arrangement of a federation was one in which there would be equity within the federation.
2 senators
So
per
the
term.
equity would be balanced out, would be between the provinces or the states in the case of the United States, in the case of Canada, the provinces, in the upper chamber, representing an equal status with all the other provinces of the Federation. And then in the lower house, the House of Commons, the House of Representatives, based upon population, the allocation of representation, and that would then represent the way the population is spread out across the Federation. And so that sense of equity, that sense of that there is no one member of the Federation holds a position not only asymmetrical to the rest, but a privileged position. In a word, in today's language, two-tier system. That wouldn't be there. Albertans are no less than Quebecois. But here we have, in this federation of our in Confederation, we have Central Canada with double majorities, and therefore a two-tier system in contrast to the rest of Canada. And that sense of two-tier system in our federation is most acutely sensed in Alberta than possibly in Prince Edward Island. Because here is the numbers that I was driving at, which is the most astounding feature of our present day federation, that of the 10 provinces, only 2 provinces are half provinces that contributes to the equalization payments, in which the rest of the provinces, 8 in numbers, are have-not provinces, including Quebec, which makes the most noise and demands the most special treatment, as opposed to other provinces, including Ontario. So the 2 provinces that are half provinces, which basically subsidizes the rest of Canada, that is have-not provinces, with their resources, are Alberta and Ontario. And in these 2 provinces, Alberta and Ontario, Alberta is far ahead in terms of per capita contribution than is Ontario. Ontario has a population 3 times the population of Alberta. Alberta is about 4 million plus, Ontario is about 12 million plus. And yet Alberta's contribution exceeds Ontario's contribution per capita by several, numbers. And it's right now not in my head, but one can quickly check it out. And yet, when it comes to the development of Alberta's resources, Alberta have been penalized with punitive policies. This whole issue of climate change is a boondoggle manufactured by virtue signaling politicians in central Canada, supported by Quebec, at the expense of Alberta. And other Western provinces, Saskatchewan is not too far behind in terms of natural resources. Now, this is unsustainable. And central Canada, people in Ontario should wake up and address this issue. But it hasn't happened. And so this is where maybe you and I don't disagree, but in the nuances of our expression, what has happened is central Canada and the urban centers of Canada has become the dumping ground of open-ended immigration married to multiculturalism that hollows out and dilutes and destroys the foundational culture of Canada. And therefore, its effect is, it is driven by central Canada's policies. The loyalty of the new immigrants over the last 50 years, I am one of them, in the sense of a new Canadian, but in the larger sense, we're all immigrants. But the sense of an immigrant, at least in the second generation, growing up in Canada, should be, as I was saying in my earlier remarks, brought together into a cohesive identity of which is Canadian in its foundational values. Canada is undeniably a country founded on the culture, values, faith, tradition of Europe that is Christendom. Now, Europe might have become totally radically secularized. The churches are empty, and so on and so forth. Population is diminishing with abortion and family planning and so on. The total fertility rate in Europe is negative. And we can see what has happened over the last, quarter century, if not more, that Europe, especially its main urban centers, are no longer European in that sense that Europe was, even in 1960s and 70s. And what, you and I have talked about, Enoch Powell warned against, I mean, Queen Elizabeth II died only last month. But what is her legacy of 70 years rule as a head of, as the crown head of England and then of the Commonwealth? What is the legacy she left behind? The legacy she left behind is the England that she came to be the queen of is no longer the England that was there in 1952 when her father died and she was crowned, is no longer the England that is recognizable as English. In fact, the English population, the native English population, white, Saxon, Celtic, Irish, Scot, are rapidly diminishing in number and representation in the main urban centers of England. London, the proud capital not only of England but of the Commonwealth in the sense of the greatest city, that Queen Elizabeth's ancestor, Queen Victoria, ruled, has a mayor of a South Asian origin like me. Now, that's fine to have a mayor of South Asian origin, but it is the number that has increased in a manner that we now have to question whether England is going to be the same England anymore. It is so much change in that number. After Boris Johnson, I suppose England escaped the bullet by not having Rishi Sunak as the prime minister, another Indian, and got Liz Truss. Now, Liz Truss may be a joke, but, in terms of optics, Rishi Sunak would have been the face of England with the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and so on and so forth. You see? So we are in a race of time. When people say to me, Salim, why are you speaking like this? You are an immigrant. What is your complaint? Well, I have no complaint. I'm just looking at the objective reality of what has happened to a culture, to a civilization, in a sense that was unique in the world, based upon values that was unique in the world and still unique to the extent that, people hold on to it. But in a personal sense, if you say, Salim, you are a beneficiary of multiculturalism, and so on and so forth. And I have been told that on my face. My answer is very simple. I was not born in Calcutta, India, endowed by my creator with the right, as Jefferson, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to live in Canada, to be brought to Canada, to become a Canadian. I was not born with any such natural rights. It is the generosity of Canadians. It is the generosity of Canada as a country that opened its door to people like me. And we have an obligation to defend the Canada that opened its door to people like me. And that's the race of time I see that is taking place across the Western world at the urging and at the planning and at the insistence of an elite that no longer thinks in terms of its own natural rights as a Canadian, as an American, as a Dutchman, as a German, as an English. They are citizens of the world. They are globalists. And so we have a race in time going on. Mr. Harper's government, the Liberals and the NDP, we know, they are of the left. They are globalists. But Mr. Harper's government was elected in 2006 by a fluke. He got a minority. Then 2008, he got a minority. 2011, that was another fluke. Jack Layton took the seats in Quebec that allowed Mr. Harper to form a majority government based upon the votes from central Canada, that is Ontario, and that was the only majority government he had. And then he was defeated in 2015. But the 9 years he was there, the man elected prime minister and head of a party, a conservative party, into which Albertans and the prairie provinces had invested all their hopes. The least that Mr. Harper and the conservative could and should have done is to have brought that conversation into Ottawa and opened a discussion about how to correct the imbalances in the Federation. Mr. Harper was in the inner circle of Mr. Manning. He was a Reform Party member, and he came back to take the leadership with Canadian Alliance and then engage in the merger with the Progressive Conservative after they were reduced to 2 seats to form the Conservative Party of Canada. What did Mr. Harper do in the 9 years? He did nothing. 2005, a minority government of Paul Martin passed the legislation on same-sex marriage. Just imagine, a minority government was able to pass a legislation so profound in terms of its social, ethical, and other implications in terms of traditional values in Canada. And Mr. Harper and his Conservative Party just went along with it. And then when he became the prime minister in 2006, there was no effort on his part to reopen that discussion. So what sort of conservative he was that came on the back of the Western support, and then he becomes the prime minister, not only on social and religious conservatism, but then on the hard issues of Alberta's prosperity, Western Canada's, demands for equality and correction of the imbalances. What does Mr. Harper do? He becomes the prime minister who signs on into the UN Agenda 2030, UN Agenda Sustainable Development Growth, and is the first Canadian prime minister to talk about bringing an end to the development of oil sands, because he was involved in negotiating the Paris Accord, which of course he would have gone to sign on to, but for the defeat that he faced in October of 2015, that led to Justin Trudeau and his gang of climate change artists, con artists, go to Glasgow or to Paris to sign the Paris Accord. Mr. Harper's legacy is a legacy of betrayal. He is ultimately a very small man because he couldn't face his own electorate, his own constituent, and stand up and speak to them about what he wanted to do or what he should do or what he could do, explain to them and talk to them. And the result is, now we can see his legacy is Independence Party of Alberta. His right-hand man, Jason Kenney, who wanted to be the leader of the Conservative Party of Mr. Harper, but failed to win the vote, went to Alberta, joined the United Conservative Party of Alberta to run for the premiership, got the premiership, and then resigned this year in May 2022, 1 year ahead of the next election in Alberta. That means he had the mandate to be the premier till the next election. And he resigned because he was driven out. He got 52% of vote in the leadership campaign, but he felt like Joe Clark, that was too little. People say you get 50 plus 1 and you become the leader. Well, he got 52%. He couldn't, because what I found was the extent of dissatisfaction, if not loathing, against this man and his politics and what he came to represent, which is again the legacy of Mr. Harper. So these people have taken a ride on the voters of Alberta for what turns out to be their own personal agenda. All of them have signed on to the globalist agenda, and the globalist agenda is a dagger drawn at the throat of what is the most important issue for Albertans, their natural resources and their hope for a future that will give them a way to preserve their identity of a free people based upon the values that they cherish, handed down to them by their parents and grandparents.
It's true that there's a very small window of opportunity that is facing Albertans right now, as you say, because of the changing demographics and politics of the entire country. They have very little time within which to hold a referendum that could go in their favor. Even though just simply, as you say, even just simply holding a referendum may change things. So what do you think would be the outcome then? Will they continue federally to vote Conservative, even though it is a party of lies and deception? Or would they support a Quebecer in Maxime Bernier in the People's Party, another result of failed Conservative politics? And provincially, what do you think the chances of Pastor Pawlowski's Independence Party of Alberta in the next election? Or will they just go with the UCP, which of course was led by Jason Kennedy, one of the worst tyrants in Canadian history, and what he did, perhaps not personally, but what was happened to Pastor Pawlowski? People don't remember Pawlowski was that pastor who was arrested on a rainy day in the middle of a highway for rejecting the imposition and the destruction of his individual rights under Jason Kenney. So will they continue to vote for the UCP, or does the IPA stand a chance?
Well, the UCP now has a new leader, and therefore a new premier in Alberta, Danielle Smith. Danielle Smith herself is a person that has a lot of question marks in the minds of Albertans. Given her past record, she was a leader of Wild Rose Party. And then when the UCP came along, she walked out from the Wild Rose Party. Wild Rose Party was in that sense more Albertan. It was a provincial party with a provincial agenda, not of separation or independence, but certainly, a party in some ways dedicated to developing Alberta's own resources in a manner that would be beneficial to Alberta's interests and Albertans as a whole. And Danielle Smith was the leader, or she had been elected the leader, and then she abandoned the Wild Rose Party and crossed the floor, expecting that she would end up being a leader of UCP and become the premier. And then she lost that leadership to Jason Kenney. And so it seems, or at least that's what people told me in the conversation when I wanted to know what was the thoughts about the leadership race. When I was there, the leadership race had not been concluded. The vote hadn't taken place. And so they felt that Danielle Smith is someone that they wouldn't trust, the people I was talking to in the interior. So here it comes again, the divide between the population, rural Alberta, small town Alberta, and the people in the main metropolitan center, Calgary and Edmonton, and their vote. And I think Danielle Smith, she contested the leadership when Jason Kenney stepped down, and her numbers came from the I would imagine from the urban centers. It is very interesting that after winning the leadership and becoming the premier, she doesn't have a seat in the legislature. She has now announced that she will be seeking a seat in a by-election and that by-election will take place in Medicine Hat. She has said that she purposely has decided to run in Medicine Hat because she wants to represent the rural Albertans. She wants to assure the rural Albertans that their voices will be heard in Edmonton, and that they will be what they stand for and what they want will be taken seriously, as she is the premier from that part of Alberta, rural Alberta. So we will see. But the race is, again, the race of new Canadians that have been pouring into Alberta in Calgary and Edmonton. And by design, I was told when I was there, and I heard about it also from other sources, that Jason Kenney was going through Toronto and headed into main metro station, subway station, like the downtown subway station at King and Yonge, or the Union Station, where he was glad-handing with the people during the rush hours and inviting them to come to Alberta, to migrate to Alberta, and these are all by design. These are all way to, bring in a population that will be, in a sense, of a different state of mind, different value system, different approaches to, again, dilute that cohesive identity of Alberta as Albertans. That's what we've been talking about, you and I, in this segment. And you can see that not only the two mayors in Alberta are of that liberal, conservative, multiculturalism background. The Lieutenant Governor General that has been appointed in Alberta is a woman, Salma Lakhani, who is an Ismaili Muslim. And this is not only a first. Well, there is always a time to be a first. We have the Governor General, who is a first, a native Canadian as our Governor General. But this woman, Salma Lakhani, an Ismaili Muslim. And here I must take a pause. In a different conversation with people, I asked them, in Alberta, these elections and these appointments that have been made, have people done due diligence? Do you know their background? Do you know what they stand for? What do they represent? So here it is about Salma Lakhani background. She's an Ismaili Muslim. And the question is, who are the Ismaili Muslims and what do they represent? What value do they represent? And will they defend Canadian interests, or will they defend interests other than what is Canadian interests? And my view on this matter is to understand who the Ismaili Muslims are. They are a small segment within the larger Muslim world, 2 billion people. The Ismaili Muslims are a very small fraction of that 2 billion people, or nearly 2 billion people, somewhere around 15 million. So it's a small sect, just there are sects within Christianity, like the Seventh-day Adventists and so on and so forth. Jehovah's Witness, etc. But the key point here is that the leader of this sect is the Aga Khan. Aga Khan is a spiritual leader. Aga Khan and the Ismailis don't have a country to run. If they had a country to run, then they would be a country of Ismaili Muslim values. So they don't have, they are like the Jews were at one time. Now Jews have a state, Israel. They are a people in sort of spread across the world and living in among Muslim populations, say in South Asia, parts of Middle East and so on. But now in greater and greater number, they have moved into Western countries, in England and now in Canada. And we need to know what they represent, what the Aga Khan represents as the spiritual leader. Because as a spiritual leader, like the Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhists, Dalai Lama doesn't have a country, but he has a tremendous influence among the people in exile, the Tibetan Buddhists who are living around the world. And what the Dalai Lama tells them, that's how they behave, that's how they act in their personal life and in their public life, the position that they would take. So the Aga Khan's history goes back to the British rule of India. Aga Khan's grandfather was, in a sense, a creation of the British Crown in India, Aga Khan I, and very much a man who has served the British Empire very loyally, and for which he was very loyally and adequately rewarded. Now, his sons and grandsons, they live in exile. They are spiritual leader of this community that have been quite successful in business and profession and in Canada. But they have been people or individuals who are wrapped around that the interest first of Britain and then subsequently the United Nations. You know, they made home in France, they made home in Europe, and they have served the United Nations. Aga Khan's uncles and cousins have had very senior position in the United Nations. Sadruddin Aga Khan for many years was the High Commissioner for the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, UNHCR. And this Aga Khan, Karim Aga Khan, became a personal friend of Pierre Elliott Trudeau at the time of the Uganda crisis when Idi Amin was expelling Indians from South Asia out of Uganda and followed by places where he had influence. And so in that expulsion that took place, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was approached by the Prince Karim Aga Khan to see if he would help bring these people to Canada, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau opened the door, and a lot of them migrated to Canada. So we have first, second, third generation Ismaili Muslims now who have been very successful in Canada in all the profession, but politically they have been cultivated by the Liberal Party and now the Conservative Party. So the Aga Khan was made an honorary Canadian, awarded the honorary Canadian citizenship by Stephen Harper. In the modern history of Canada, there are only 5 honorary Canadians that have been nominated and then voted to that position. Most famously, Nelson Mandela, then the Dalai Lama, I believe. Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, Raoul Wallenberg of Sweden, Malala Yousafzai, the young girl who was the Nobel Prize winner, a peace winner from Afghan-Pakistan border, and the Aga Khan. And my question or point is that the Aga Khan is very much a globalist. He's part of that crowd, the Devas crowd. And the Ismaili Muslims will follow that leadership of the Aga Khan in pushing in various capacities the globalist agenda. And that's what we are seeing at all 3 levels of Canadian government, as in other parts of Western world, but in Canada, the federal, the provincial, and the municipal, the people, political parties are supporting the globalists, and the globalists have made inroads. I mean, here in London, we are having a World Economic Forum convention, I believe, ahead of the municipal election that's taking place. And so this is the operation in which both the Liberals and the Conservative have made appointments that goes, in my view, and the views of all of us who oppose the globalist agenda, have made appointments to further the globalist agenda. And that if anybody questions these things, these people, then they will be stigmatized by smear and vilification. You're a bigot, you're a racist, you're fringe, and so on and so forth. And people are silent, people are uninformed, People do not know what is happening. And the legacy then, I mean, on the liberal side is quite clear where they stand, but on the conservative side, it is a fake opposition, it is Decepticons. They have fully and completely engaging in the same globalist agenda while they talk from the other side of the mouth that they are opposition party, they're conservative party, they will do things that the liberals and the NDP wouldn't do. And so whatever the people vote for ends up with the same result. And I think that is one thing that the Albertans are waking up to. They might not be fully aware of the background of their Lieutenant Governor General. They might not know all about Nahid Nanshi or the Sikhs, who, whether their due diligence was done about them, where do they stand in terms of their relationship to this separatist movement within the Sikh community, the Khalistani, the secession movement that led to so much problems in India. They might not know about that, but they do understand that their province has been at the receiving end negatively of the imbalances in the Canadian Federation.
Yes, it's an interesting time in Alberta, and looking forward to see how Pastor Pawlowski fares with his independent party. And I'm very happy to see that such discussions are still allowed in this country, that you can talk about these things. Yeah. And the outpouring of support that you had in Alberta, I understand that you didn't really spend any time in hotels. You were being billeted by the supporters of the group that you were traveling with. So that's very much a grassroots outpouring of support for you guys. So thank you again, Salim, and good to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Robert. Thank you so much.